Before we get started with Dr. Hellman, I have a couple of elected officials to recognize. Seated at the front here is Commissioner Janet Carlson, Commissioner Kevin Cameron, Sheriff Jason Myers. I haven't seen you yet this morning. He's coming. Our district attorney, Walt Beglau, is here, and County Clerk Bill Burgess is attending as well. The Commission would definitely like to thank the City of Kaiser and Chief John Teague for hosting us this morning. We've been at this facility for several years, and it's a beautiful facility. Thank you very much, Chief, for allowing us to be here. So let's get to what we're all here for, which is the theory of hope. Dr. Chan Hellman is a professor at Anne and Henry Zarrow School of Social Work and a founding director of the Center of Applied Research for Not-for-Profit Organizations. I changed this in the words because, in my opinion, nonprofit means you don't have any, and I definitely disagree with that. All of our organizations create profit every day with every life we save, every person we feed, and every person that we take out of harm's way. So that's why I changed those words. Dr. Hellman is also an adjunct professor in the Department of Internal Medicine and Pediatrics at the University of Oklahoma College of Medicine. He is also the Department of Health and Promotion Sciences, the director there, at the University of Oklahoma College of Public Health. In his spare time, he likes to come to Salem and Kaiser to teach us all about the hope theory. In particular, he is interested on how not-for-profit organizations impact client hope and how hope is associated with the positive goal of attainment and well-being, along with those that have experienced adverse traumas and stress, such as child maltreatment, homelessness, domestic violence, and substance abuse. His publications have appeared in various scientific journals and book chapters. Additionally, he has presented his research at a national and international scholar conferences. Chan teaches at both master's and doctorate level, primarily in the areas of positive psychology, research methods, and statistics. So please help me welcome Dr. Chan Hellman.
Thank you, Cindy, and thank you all. Good morning. Thank you, Tamara and Mary and the group for bringing us back out to Salem. You guys, for those of you who were here last year or remember last year, leaving Salem was a little scary given the snow and ice trying to get back to Tulsa. Saturday, all day Saturday in Tulsa, it was sleeting and freezing rain and temperature of 17, so I was worried about getting back out here, but it just felt appropriate to experience that weather again. So thank you for taking time out of your schedules to come and listen to a professor talk about this concept of hope. I would also say that as the founding director of the Center of Applied Research for Nonprofit Organizations, which is a horrible title, I believe. Last week, we formally changed the title of the center to the Hope Research Center, because that's where all our work is. So thank you. I'm very excited about that and the support that I received from the university. So when we think about moving into this conversation of hope, what I want to start with is the idea that how have we characterized well-being in the helping professions over the years? And you can see the question at the bottom is really the foundation of where that work is. It's focused on the idea of what's wrong with you. And so the idea is in psychology and other social work and helping professions, we've begun to characterize individual, family, and client well-being from the prospect of how do we reduce what's wrong with you. And so the reduction of things like anxiety, depression, is what we would historically think about as the definition of well-being. And although our passion may be on how to build and restore hope, think about all of the, for those of you in the social service, human service industry, think about all of the assessments that, that you give, that you administer to your clients. And how many of them are actually focused on the true meaning of the word well-being, right? How many of you measure things that are wrong with individuals and try to assess what's wrong with them and again, characterize well-being as the reduction of that? It's just the way in which our social sciences have moved over the years, right? So the question is, in the work that I've been doing over the last decade roughly, is to try to think about what if we change the nature of that question from what is wrong with you, and we begin to understand the idea of what is right with you. Now that doesn't mean that we want to ignore the difficulties that individuals face and experience and the conditions that they present themselves with. But what we argue is that we ought to also have a balanced conversation of what strengths and resources individuals bring with them that can help them overcome the adversities that they face, right? And so the question becomes, is there a psychological strength that allows individuals, families, and communities to thrive? Is there a strength that we can focus on? And more importantly, is this a strength that we can measure, that we can assess to somehow get a metric of change in the concept of well-being? And then more importantly, can this strength be learned? Can we nurture this strength and sustain this strength through program services and targeted intervention and prevention programs? And it turns out from the research that the answer to this psychological strength is this concept of hope. And that's what I'll spend the rest of my time talking about. So there are over 2,000 published scholarly studies that have examined hope and its impact on individual and family well-being. And what we now know from that literature, our work and others across the United States, is that hope is the single best predictor of well-being. So different characterizations of this capacity to flourish, the capacity to thrive in various scenarios. As mentioned, my area of work is with family violence and extreme trauma and adversity. And so the work that we have done over the years finds that hope, again, is the single best predictor of the outcomes for the agencies that we work with, right? So in education, for instance, hope is a significant predictor of average daily attendance in elementary school. It's a significant predictor of grade point average for middle school and high school. Again, predicting attendance. In high school, hope scores actually predict course selection as students begin to think about their future. So it helps with that planning process. One part that I'm really excited to see in the emerging data from the education research is that hope is a better predictor of college performance than the ACT, SAT, and high school GPA. It's a better predictor of academic achievement in the college classroom. It's also a better predictor of retention through graduation rates, right? So education is experiencing a lot of positive success by focusing on hope. For those of you who are interested in thinking about the K through 12 system with hope, there's a group of researchers out of Gallup who study about 1 million students every year, basically 5th grade through 12th grade. So they study hope and engagement in the classroom. And what they find very consistently is, again, hope is a significant predictor of academic achievement, but that less than half of our students report being hopeful, right? Less than half of our students report being hopeful. And in fact, 34% report being engaged in the classroom, and about 40% report being actively disengaged, that is, trying to sabotage the classroom. And so while hope is a significant predictor, we have work to do in that arena. Physical health, certainly in areas of cancer treatment, spinal cord injury, HIV, diabetes, and other conditions, hope is a significant predictor of physical health outcomes, compliance, and health-seeking behaviors. Within areas of mental health, including growing literature in severe mental illness, schizophrenia, bipolar, we see very positive outcomes in that. For those of you who are within the therapy and the counseling arena, you might remember that hope is actually considered one of the common factors of treatment success, one of the 4 common factors in treatment success of therapy, and we've known that since the 1950s, right? The workplace, I'll talk a little bit more about this in a few moments, but there's a growing literature that shows very significant positive impact in the workplace. We've done studies where we're specifically focused on compassion fatigue and burnout, and what we find very consistently is that hope is a buffer to that relationship. That is, as we increase hope of our workforce, they have a stronger resistance to emotional exhaustion, right? And finally, what I'll talk about anyway for a few seconds is that there's a growing amount of research for adolescents and adults with hope scores related to criminal justice or criminality. I've done a couple of studies with women in prison in Oklahoma, and for those of you who are not familiar, Oklahoma ranks #1 in the imprisonment of women, and I think we're #3 in the imprisonment of men per capita. And so we've done a couple of studies looking at coping mechanisms for women who are in prison, and what we find is that through intervention programs that try to help with coping factors, that hope is actually the better predictor of prisoner well-being and prisoner outcomes relative to positive coping skills. You guys are familiar with the adverse childhood experiences. I just got a data set that showed that these women have an average ACE score of a 7 in that group. So hope is powerful. So the question becomes, when I use the word hope, what does that mean? So think for just a few seconds, when you hear the word hope or when you use the word hope, how do you use that, right? What are some words that come to mind when you think of hope? By the way, this is just like when I teach statistics. It's exactly the same.
Resilient.
Resilient. I love that word.
Optimistic.
Optimistic. Good. Better future. Belief. Goals. Okay. Those are all just fantastic ideas. Resilience, optimism is a part of the concept of hope. The idea with hope is that it's the belief that the future will be better, but more importantly, that I have the power to make it so. And that's the key part of it, is that I have the belief that I have the power to make the future better. And so when we think about hope, when I study hope, and when we create intervention curriculum, it's focused on the idea of 2 components. The first component, an important piece of hope, is the idea that you can develop these mental strategies or pathways to the goals that you desire. Now, what we know about lower hope individuals, especially lower hope individuals who have a history of trauma and abuse is the planning process is a little bit reduced, that these children in particular have a hard time planning or strategizing how they're going to achieve their goals. It's one of the critical components to nurturing hope. The second component is this idea of agency. And I really hesitate to use that word in my conversations, because when I say the word agency, most people think about the organization in which they work. But that's not what I'm referring to. Agency is this mental energy, the willpower that you have that you can dedicate towards the pathways or the strategies towards goal attainment. More importantly, that you can control that willpower and dedicate it towards the goal pursuits in the presence of adversity. That's the aspects of hope as we study it. If I ask you if hope comes from the head, the heart, or from outside of you, maybe God or something, what is your perspective of the origin of hope? Is it point to your head or your heart or something out, or all? All. So all of those are actually accurate in the way in which we think and characterize hope. The work that we do, the way we focus that at the University of Oklahoma and the Hope Research Center, is that hope is a cognitive process, that it's a mental process of planning and dedicating our mental energy towards something. That emotion is an outcome of hope. This emotional experience is an outcome of our goal pursuits. And the reason that that's so important in the way that we study it is because if it's a thought process, then now we can teach it. Hope can be learned, right? So I want to just talk a little bit about a few components of hope. First of all is that this idea of goals are the cognitive endpoints to purposeful behavior. And I highlight the idea of purposeful behavior because within the framework of achieving our goals, what we're talking about are planned and intentional actions. I'm not talking about impulse or habit, right? That this is thoughtful behavior. The important aspect of hope is that the goals must be desirable by the individual. The individual must want the outcome. It doesn't work so well if it's your goal for that individual and they don't desire that outcome, right? As I mentioned, higher hope individuals are actually able to strategize long-term goals. They're also able to develop more or multiple pathways to the goal pursuits. Higher hope individuals can actually begin to imagine the problems and difficulties that they're going to experience before they even start the journey. And so they have a really strong problem-solving capability, right? And then the agency aspect is one of the important findings in the literature is that our willpower is actually connected to the glucose levels in our blood. And so what is glucose for the human body? It's energy, right? It's energy. And so the research shows that about 66% of the glucose is actually depleted through our brains, right? And so you know when you're emotionally or just exhausted, mentally exhausted. And so the importance of bringing up the idea of glucose, first of all, you're actually eating a good breakfast of fruit. But more importantly, nutrition matters. Nutrition matters in the long term for sustaining hope. So the theory of hope is actually very simple. Goals, pathway, and agency, or willpower. And I often like to describe the idea that as a psychologist, and as an academic psychologist, I've been trained to why use 5 words, or in this case 3 words, when I can use 500 words to describe a psychological concept, right? And that's the real beauty of hope. And for those of you who will be here after this for the training piece, the application of it is greatly enhanced because it's so accessible. The concept of hope is relatively easy. But both willpower and way power are required for hope. So if I have a goal that I desire, I'm really motivated to attain that goal, but I don't know how to get there from here, we would actually consider you to be lower in hope. And so, for instance, the work that I do in the prevention and intervention of child abuse and the work with parents is the idea that parents are actually motivated, by and large, to have a positive parent-child relationship quality. They just don't have the parenting skills necessary to keep the children safe. They don't have the pathway strategies for that. In that regard, I've come to believe that all of our program services are pathways of hope. Those are all the strategies in your organizations and the work that you do that are there to allow the clients and the community to achieve the goals that they desire. The hard work is willpower. The hard work is getting people motivated to pursue those pathways and to sustain that pursuit, especially in the presence of daily adversity, right? So that's the hard work. Now, as I mentioned, both are required. So sometimes, for instance, we have a goal that is out there that maybe we desire, and we have the pathways for that goal pursuit. We're just not motivated for those pathways. We're really not interested in that pathway, that way to get there. Again, we would consider that individual low in hope. And again, the work that I do, I tend to think about, for instance, court-ordered individuals for batterer treatment programs and domestic violence, right? So the idea of going to a 50-week intervention or 52-week intervention program is not necessarily something that people are motivated to do necessarily. And so those individuals would be characterized as lower in hope. Now, goals, pathway, agency. So what I'd like you to do for a second is think about all the times you use the word hope in your daily life. And so for instance, I hope it doesn't snow today, right? Actually, I don't care if it does today. It's tomorrow when I fly out that I care about. But we use the word hope in that context all the time, right? And so the idea is I just use that statement. I greatly desire the goal, right? I'm really motivated for that goal. I just don't have the pathways. I don't control the pathways to do that. And in fact, that's the difference between a wish and hope. That's how we actually define a wish. And so what I want to highlight here is that hope is about action. Hope is about taking the steps necessary to achieve the goal. That's the important difference. So when we think about how hope actually works, and we've actually identified a goal that we want to pursue, and think about all of the ideas that there may be multiple pathways to attain the goal. So for instance, my very first semester in college as a first semester freshman, my grade point average was a 0.58, right? A 0.58. I've actually never met anybody who has a grade point average lower than me. And so I have to respond to that you too can be a professor at the University of Oklahoma, right? Now I knew from the beginning that I did want to be a professor, and getting a 0.58 grade point average makes getting into graduate school pretty hard, right? And so think about all of the pathways that you've taken to achieve what you've achieved, and you look back and think, man, there was an easier way, right? And so as I begin to describe this, how hope works, how agency or willpower and pathways thinking work in an example, what I want to recognize is that life is much more complex than this linear graph I'm about to show you, right? That this pathways pursuit is a little bit more complex, but just for ease of explanation, bear with me. So once we start down a brand new pathway, think about how you are with regards to things like self-confidence, right? I highly desire the goal. My energy is really high, but I'm pretty tentative. My self-confidence is a little low. And so I start down the pathway a little timid, perhaps. Now, what's important to nurture hope, to build hope, is the idea that you set very specific benchmarks that need to be achieved in order to reach our goal. I like to actually work backwards. And so when I work with a doctoral student, for the very first time they come in and say, I want to do a PhD, I want to do a dissertation on hope, my very first question is, when do you want to graduate? I want that end goal in mind. Okay, if you want to graduate in May of whatever, then what has to happen? Okay, before that happens, what has to? So I start to set the benchmarks for the students, because what I'm trying to do is to get them to realize that the moment they step out of my office, they've hit that first benchmark to graduating, right? I've connected the future to today, and that's nurturing the aspects of hope. So we have these benchmarks, and let's just assume that we start to experience success. So our confidence gets better, we're faster, we're more efficient at that process, which is the strength of the goals. And now, as we're moving forward and our confidence is higher, we can actually begin to scan and fine-tune our pathway pursuits, but begin to look at ways in which we can actually stretch and enhance that process. Now, this is the interesting part, right? This is where the rest of life happens, right? So we go down these pathway pursuits. We're focusing a lot of our mental energy towards these pathways, but the rest of life's priorities are also demanding our attention. And so if we think about the clients that we serve, in one scenario, we're very interested in working on employment skills. And so we've got a plan that they're going to come in and we're going to work on resume, interviewing skills, and all of that. And as they walk in the door, they let you know that they're about to be evicted. They're not sure that they have enough money for food. They've got all of these other competing priorities. So my point is, focusing on employment skills when they come in with all of this mental energy focused elsewhere makes that pathway pursuit really difficult. And so the work that you already do is you learn how to settle the current crisis so we can get back to those pathway pursuits. And so the question becomes, how do you manage your willpower on a day-to-day basis? And that's the hard part of hope. That is the actual hard part, is managing your mental energy. Now, for many of you, you also work with individuals who have experienced trauma and extreme adversity. And historically, we assess that through the adverse childhood experiences, but there are other mechanisms. What I'll tell you is that unmitigated trauma is an attention robber in the hope process. It actually will rob the mental energy necessary for pathway pursuits. So what I want to tell you is that in summary of all the literature, I've got a few more slides, but in summary of all of the literature, hope can assist you in overcoming adversity so that you can live life well. And that's really what we're interested in. What does it mean to live a good life? What does that look like for individuals? And what we know is that hope can help you overcome the adversities to live life well. Alternatively, it can help you find strategies to live well within the adversities that you experience, right? So I always like to talk a little bit about the loss of hope, or lower levels of hope. And so I've given this presentation several times, probably 100 or so times, and this is my favorite question. So I think some of you have probably been in here before. I recognize some folks. So I will ask you, for those of you who've not heard this before, you can answer this question. What is the opposite of hope? Despair.
Apathy.
Apathy? Despair? Despair. So traditionally, every presentation I get, the answer is despair. And so I have to tell you, you're wrong. Apathy is the actual right response. But I want to spend just a brief moment really kind of focusing on why despair is not the opposite of hope. And I've been thinking about this quite a bit for the last couple of months. And what does desperate behavior look like? Right? What is desperation in the way in which we act towards something? It may be impulsive. It's kind of impulsive, but it's really with the intention of attaining the unattainable, the potentially unattainable, right? So maybe a basketball player who's just kind of falling and shoots the basket, that's in desperation because, under normal circumstances, that's not the way they shoot. But it's this idea that I still desire the goal. I still have mental energy focused on the goal. And so that would actually be lower hope, but it's not the opposite of hope. Apathy is the opposite of hope. So spend just a second thinking about what is hopelessness. What is hopelessness? So hopelessness is when the outcome has already been determined and there's nothing you can do to change it. Right? There's nothing you can do. It's already been decided. So what happens when our goals are blocked? We experience an emotional reaction. In this case, I've included the idea of rage as an emotional reaction. Now, I also want to highlight the idea that when our goals are blocked, when we start to experience the barrier to our goal pursuits, many of us have the possibility of finding alternative pathways or changing the course to still pursue the goals, right? Many of us also have the ability or capacity to change the nature of our goals just a little bit so that it does become capable. What I want to talk about is when that goal that we strongly desire, when there is no alternative pathway and we can't re-goal. And so after we experience rage and we begin to understand that we're really not very likely to attain the goal, then we move into this idea of despair. And we might engage in desperate behaviors, and we might engage in desperate emotions and cognitions, right? And then finally is the idea of apathy, which is the lack of goal-directed behavior and the lack of motivation. So think for a minute, stereotypically or hypothetically, about a third grade child who lays their head down on a desk in the classroom, right? And has that apathetic behavior, and the teacher may be trying to engage. And I think it's fine for us to go ahead and get past the idea that we can put some blame on the school system, we can put some blame on the child, and we can put some blame on the parents or the family. And then once we get past that, let's really think about that apathetic behavior for a minute. If we think about it in the context of hope, what we recognize is that the child doesn't see that classroom as a pathway to the goals they desire. They don't see the connection of that classroom. And so the idea or the capacity to nurture hope, to turn around apathy, is the work that I'm really interested in. This is where my research is at, is working with people who are experiencing despair and apathy, and can we turn that around? So basically, and I'll get through this slide pretty quickly, lower hope individuals will typically face a new goal with negativity and a focus on failure. So the idea of asking them to move towards a goal, they're going to be really focused on all of the reasons why they can't attain the goal or can't be successful in life. And what we know is that lower hope individuals suffer both mentally, socially, and physically as well. So these are the three questions that drive all of my work, both research as well as community outreach that I do. First of all, I'm really interested in the idea is hope a buffer to adversity and stress? That is, are people who have higher levels of hope, I'll use the word, more resilient? Do hopeful individuals behave differently? Do they have better outcomes, both behaviorally and cognitively? And then finally, and I think the work that maybe many of you are interested in, can we nurture and sustain hope? Can we move the needle with individuals? Over 150 studies that I've been involved in with the idea of hope and 2,000 published studies from other researchers, I can tell you that the answer to those three questions is yes. Right. So trauma and hope. What we know is that, and we typically use the ACE measure when we study hope, and what we find very consistently is the idea that higher levels of trauma are associated with lower levels of hope with individuals. And I will also point out that at the very far end, by 4, you see a slight increase in hope. That's very consistent in our studies. We tend to see that slight increase with higher adverse events. And I've talked to several providers about that. I don't fully understand it. One of the better explanations that I've found is basically that it's a survival response, right? It's a survival response. If I've experienced all of this in my path, I might be able to survive a lot of things, right? I think that's an oversimplification perhaps, but it's an area that I think is interesting, that hope starts to go back up. So you guys are familiar with ACE, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. What we know is that it turns out that an adverse childhood event score of 1 or higher is not good. We tend to be focused on an ACE score of 4 or higher because of the work that I do in the nonprofits and family violence and poverty area tends to have pretty high trauma rates. So you guys are all pretty familiar with these outcomes of that. And there's been a real push across the country for us to assess ACE, to spend more time recognizing the presence of adversity within the clients we serve. I think the question that needs to follow that is, and then what, right? We've measured it, but now what? And I personally think that the answer to that is hope, because we can actually nurture that. In the next session, we're going to spend pretty significant time actually showing how to build hope, how to nurture hope. But it starts with the process of goal setting and recognizing the nature of desirable goals, which increases, for a short term anyway, individuals' willpower. The willpower will increase. The part that I will pay a little bit of attention to here is the idea that throughout that process of goal setting and identifying the pathways, the potential pathways that individuals might have available to them, is to spend enough time with this idea of creating future memories of success, right? You want to spend enough time with individuals as they begin to imagine what their lives will be like when they attain the goal. And it's a reinforcing process of this capacity to imagine that the future is going to be better and that they have the power to make it so. I study Camp Hope, which is now a national program for children exposed to domestic violence. So just a real quick example of what I've been talking about. You can see that with this chart or table, these children, it's an average age of about 10 years old, actually experience more than just domestic violence in terms of their exposure to that. In fact, 55% of the children who attend Camp Hope have an ACE score of 4 or higher. I think Washington had an average score of 7, an ACE score of 7. And so these are kids who have experienced a lot of trauma, and average age again is 10, with a lot of life left to lead. What's interesting is the prevalence of the adverse childhood experiences area, right? And so historically, when we look at this with kids, the highest percentage or prevalence is with parental divorce, right? That's really generally the highest one. But if you look at this, the experience of parental divorce is probably in the middle to lower middle of prevalence. They actually experience a whole host of other things at a higher rate, right? Like domestic violence, parent incarceration, et cetera. We've done a couple of studies with kids who have parents in prison, as well as alternative sentencing. In particular, we've looked at mothers who have been given community sentencing for nonviolent drug-related crimes and compared them to children who have a mother in prison in Oklahoma. And turns out it's not good for a child to have a mother in prison in terms of their child attachment. And so alternative sentencing programs are something to consider. So what we saw is that when we measured hope across time, before camp, last day of camp, and a follow-up, that we actually saw a significant increase in a child's hope through targeted intervention. This is not a therapeutic camp, by the way. It's a challenge by choice camp. It's kind of an adventure camp where a kid gets to be a kid for a week. I will tell you that we've actually been studying a pretty large number of these kids for longer than a camp. We've studied them for a full year, and we've seen that we're able to actually sustain hope, so it increases and then sustains over the course of the year. Unintended consequence of that is that when we saw the increase in a child's hope, it actually predicted academic achievement about 6 months later, which is not, academics was not even part of the intervention program, but it was a nice residual outcome. That's a program funded by Verizon. We also measured the changes in the child hope. We actually looked at the adult observations of that child's behavior, and what we find is that increasing a child's hope changes the nature of their character development, right? Which is what most of our youth programs are interested in, is character development. And so that intervention program is now in 8 states. It's targeted to be in 20 states next year. So what we know from the literature is that trauma is bad. Unmitigated trauma reduces hope. One of the things that we're interested in is that once people experience trauma, is this idea of rumination. That is, they continue to think about and reflect on the past and the trauma, and that tends to reduce hope. And to combat that, we've done a number of studies that looked at the impact of mindfulness and meditation programs to reduce the rumination to actually increase hope. Right? I do a lot of work with the Family Justice Center model for domestic violence, as well as local domestic violence agencies and shelters. And what we find is that those programs actually demonstrate an increase in client hope. We actually were interested in one of those studies at looking at survivor-defined success. So we asked the survivors to set goals that they wanted to attain. We measured the increase in their hope, and then we saw that that change in hope was predictive of goal attainment for the survivors. CASA programs, we find those to have significant impact on hope. What we find with child abuse and neglect is that parents who are hopeful go through intervention and prevention programs at a faster and more successful rate, suggesting that we start our intervention programs with a hope assessment and find ways to nourish hope for program success. I just point all of those out because what I want to tell you is that Camp Hope had a very specific hope-based curriculum that we developed, but all of these others, all of your programs are pathways of hope. And so this idea of hope, and what I've been talking about for almost too long, is the idea that hope is a very simple concept. It's goals, pathway, and agency. And your programs are pathways of hope for the people that you work with, right? And so the work that I'm actually doing, studying hope, is nothing more than a description of what it is you're already doing, right? You're already doing it. The importance of this language of hope is that it gives us a common language, a common conversation to talk about and describe the work that you already do. And more importantly, we now have really good science to measure that and to provide metrics about the effectiveness of the interventions and prevention programs that you're already doing. So my argument and my plea and my call for this is the language, is the conversation of hope. It's to recognize that the science of hope is well established and that hope is actually a very powerful concept. And that as a community, if you can come together with a common language, imagine the collective impact that you could potentially have. Imagine the power of advocacy if you're all using the same language with good science and metrics to back up what you're already doing, right? It's easier to communicate across disciplines if you have a common unifying conversation. So a couple real quick things that we're interested in is this workplace. And it's with the framework of you can't give what you don't have. So the idea of if a service provider has lower levels of hope, how do we expect them to work well with clients who come in searching for hope? And the idea of hope, and with the clients that come into our agencies, it's the idea of sometimes you have to lend hope to others until they can find it for themselves, right? And so you need to have this level of hope. And so I'm interested in this idea of hope-informed leadership. And so these are some of the studies that we're currently looking at, is what does hope-informed look like as it relates to a community relations plan, to board development, to fundraising, to employee development. I would also include volunteer development in the agencies. I think the evidence that we've been doing is pretty clear with regards to the client outcomes. But as we begin to think about what does that look like for us in our workplace, in our personal and professional lives, I think that warrants us to at least consider the possibilities. What we know from our research and others is that when employees score higher on hope, the evidence shows that there's better performance in the workplace, there's lower turnover, lower absenteeism, higher job satisfaction. In studying leaders who score higher on hope are perceived by their employees as being transformational leaders as opposed to transactional leaders, right? What we also know is that when we have leaders with higher levels of hope, the culture of the workplace enhances creativity among employees, which strengthens problem-solving capabilities, right? So what the literature tells us then is that hope is the link between leadership and program effectiveness. As Napoleon said, a leader's role is to instill hope in their employees, right? This is the area that I just started to become interested in. So collective hope. We did a study, and I'm going to finish up, I promise. We did a study this last semester. I've been really interested in individual hope. The science is great, the evidence is amazing, but what does collective hope look like? What happens if a community comes together and shares the vision for the future and can collectively identify solutions to goal attainment and then collectively be able to dedicate the energy necessary to achieve the goals for a city or a community. So we did a study last semester. That's one of the wonderful things about being a professor. You get these crazy ideas and they let you teach a class. So I taught a class this semester called How Hopeful is Tulsa? And the goal of the class was actually to have a room full of students who would help us answer that question. First of all, how in the world do you do that? How do you measure that? How do you get people to fill out the survey? And then so what? You know, what does it matter if people are hopeful or less hopeful? So that's what we actually did over the semester. From my perspective, the goal was to understand the methodology. So once we're able to do that, the power becomes what are the important questions your community has about the power of hope. Now, this comes up in the conversation all the time, hope and basic needs like housing, safety, food, transportation. And what I'll tell you is that there's a small positive relationship with both individual and collective hope, but our basic needs, our hope is not dependent upon basic needs. Even though we may struggle with food security, for instance, we still have the capacity to hope. We still have the capacity to imagine the future. In my work with studying the homeless, what would it look like for our homeless population if they didn't have hope, right? What would it look like in our substance abuse and recovery programs if there was no hope, right? Without hope, why change, right? So what we also know is that hope is a social gift. Hope is something that we can influence with each other. And so we did find a pretty moderate relationship to both individual and collective hope. Interestingly, we know that hope, individual hope, is one of the single best predictors of well-being, like happiness. Collective hope was only moderately correlated to that, right? Which starts to show that it's different, right? What was different is that collective hope was a strong predictor of social action in the community. So if we think about the idea that our community or our organization or our group wants to attain a particular goal, we need to think about how do we nourish the collective hope so that we can move towards action, right, in that. The really fun part of that study was we had one of the students in the class was an epidemiologist from the Tulsa City County Health Department, and she had access to the public health data. And what she found is that there was a strong relationship between individual and collective hope and life expectancy in the city of Tulsa. I'll kind of come close to the end here, but as we start thinking about how do you nurture collective hope, we have to pay attention to our leadership. And what we found is that while trust in our leaders is somewhat important for happiness, and again, somewhat important for individual hope, it's critical for collective hope. For collective hope to be instilled, we have to have leaders and leadership that we can trust. So I'm going to come close to closing here, but here is a statement that I think summarizes this aspect of hope, right? At the heart of change is your capacity to imagine the way things are right now in your life, and to begin to think about the possibilities of what could be, right? And it's this power to imagine, and that is the essence of hope. Now, I want to give a shameful plug. Shameful, I fully acknowledge that. So we've written a book, and the book called Hope Rising was not written for the academic community. It's based upon all of the presentations that we've been giving and the trainings and workshop on how to nurture and nourish hope. So this is a book that will be coming out shortly. It'll be in bookstores in November. It'll be on Amazon, I just learned yesterday, May 1st. And then I get advance copies April 20, if anybody would like those. But look for the book. About 90% of the book is dealing with trauma and adversity and how to rise hope in individuals and communities. So it's a resource to this. And as you can see, we had a great endorsement by Dr. Folletti, as well as retired Lieutenant General from the Marine Corps and some other pretty strong endorsements of the book. So with that, I want to once again thank you for bringing me back out to beautiful Salem, Oregon. You guys have trees, which is amazing to me, and they're big and tall and they smell great. But thank you again, and thank you for your time, and have a fantastic day.
Isn't hope an amazing thing? I feel more hopeful just sitting in the audience hearing this again. I was remiss in our introductions. We do have several local judges in the audience, so if you would please stand and be recognized. Judge Broyles, back here in the back. Hello. Judge Ziranoff here. I want to highlight one of the things that Judge Broyles and many of us, including myself, work on is mental health court. And can you imagine when we instill hope in folks that have committed a crime and also have mental illness in their background, and how can they achieve a more hopeful future, a more stable future? And I think that this theory will really help us with our therapeutic courts. Want to leave you with a true life hope story. I know a gentleman who was diagnosed a year ago with stage 4 lung cancer. It had already metastasized to his liver and his spleen and broken 4 vertebrae in his back. When he received this message, his wife was digging around in this bowl in the doctor's office of pins, and she found a pin that said, "Have hope." And she took it with her. And over the next course of several months and tests, they found out that he had a gene realignment and that there was a targeted treatment that he could do that would help him recover. He's a non-smoker, by the way, and so this was a horrific disease for someone who has a very stable life, very comfortable life, and then now was faced with death. Every day his wife would say, "Have hope, today's going to be a good day," and he was truly at hopelessness at that point. Every test along the way, the numbers got better. Every test along the way, a smile grew bigger on his face. About 6 months into treatment, the Have Hope pin started to break down because the wife wore it every day. She'd lost it a couple times and completely freaked out. So now the pin has a safety pin and some duct tape, and she still wears it every day. It's not as pretty as it was in the beginning, but it still carries that message. Now this husband and wife, almost a year later, say today is a great day to have a great day. And all of his tumors are 50% smaller or greater. He still has a road to travel, but this man has gone from hopelessness to very hopeful for his future. I know this man because he's my husband, and this is the very amazing pin that I got at the Night Cancer Institute at OHSU over a year ago. So you can build hope even with people that have lost it. And just because you might have a stable life doesn't mean that you aren't hopeful and that you might be hopeless. I think everyone can build hope. And with that, I encourage you to look at Marion County, look at Kaiser, look at Salem, look at your staff, look at your partners, and let's figure out how we can create hope in our community so that we are a better, stronger place to live. Thank you for being here this morning, and if you're staying this afternoon, you're going to get a great education. And thank you to the commission for putting this on, and let's have a hopeful day.
It's always fun to get to start with a message of hope, and I think that that movie has so many themes of hope, and once you start to get to hang out with the wonderful Chan Hellman, you start seeing hope everywhere in the community. So I will start with telling you a little bit about myself. But the first thing I want to tell you is I am not an expert in hope. That is Dr. Hellman. I have just had the great honor to become a believer of hope and the wonderful opportunity to get to put hope to work in my community and in many of the jobs that I've been so fortunate to work in. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself before I tell you more about Thurston County. And just a little bit about how I came to be here before you today. And I will tell you that I started out in the audience just like you, listening to a presentation from Chan Hellman. So I'll tell a little bit more about that later. But more about me. Up on this screen here, you can see some of my pathways to hope. I have 4 beautiful children, and they are there on the right. That was at the Portland Rose Garden, one of our favorite places to go, or one of my favorite places that I drag my children. And my children have had some hard times. I myself, in my childhood, have had 5 ACEs, and my children have had some too. I'm a survivor of domestic violence and sexual assault, and so I have seen some hopelessness not only in my life, but also with a lot of the work that I have done. Right now, I am Director of Public Health and Social Services in Thurston County, which is in Olympia, Washington. But I've had a really wonderful journey and have got the opportunity to do a lot of the work that I think many of you do or have done in this room. So I started out in behavioral health, doing mental health counseling, and also I worked at Child Protective Services. My position at CPS was to assist in the removal of children from their parents, and I have gone through a lot of trauma along with the parents and the children through my many years that I worked for Child Protective Services. I've worked in schools as an educator with both in early learning programs as well as parent education. For 14 years, I had the just amazing honor to get to be the executive director of the Family Support Center of South Sound. That is one of the largest nonprofits in Olympia, and the mission of that organization is working together to strengthen all families. The programs offered at the Family Support Center were a really comprehensive range of services. That organization is the coordinated entry for all homeless families in our community, runs the largest family shelter. I developed an affordable housing project when I was there. Low-income families come and get lots of different types of assistance that I know many of you offer here in the community. I also got to have the incredible chance, which led me on my path to meeting Chan, to open up the second Family Justice Center in the state of Washington. Domestic violence is a passion of mine, and together with our prosecutor, our clerk, our sheriff's office, and my organization, as well as dozens of other partners, we came together to offer co-located services to survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking. So that kept me pretty busy. In addition, I chaired a group called the Asset Building Coalition, and we worked to promote assets for those living in poverty. I myself, having been a single mother and gone through some of the experiences I had, knew what it was like to be low income and to be a struggling parent. I joined the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence Board of Directors, and I'm still on that, and I really enjoy that, and sometimes I get to work with the coalition that you have here in the state of Oregon as well. Through the Family Justice Center, I got connected to the Alliance for Hope. That's our international organization of family justice centers. And again, that's where Chan and I got to meet. I'm going to tell you a little bit more later about Thurston Thrives. That is our coalition that's very similar to your commission here today. So that path there is a beach path that I frequently run. I love to run, and just like I always see hope everywhere now, I'm always looking for pathways as well. I have been in my position as the health director and administrator for our local public health department for about a year, and have been hard at work in trying to put hope into action there. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So one of the reasons I'm really happy to get to be here in your community, which is lovely, I got to spend the day yesterday visiting many amazing nonprofit organizations. It was just a humbling and amazing day, and I really enjoyed getting to speak with many of you and looking around your community, and I just felt the support that's here. I see so many signs that say family and support everywhere, and so that was really, really incredible. So being from Olympia, Thurston County is also the state capital, and our populations are pretty close. You're a little bit bigger. I understand you have many more cities than we do. We have about 6 cities, and I know you have about 25 or so. So, but population is similar. We have about a quarter of our population are kids, and that's what we're here for. Equal levels of poverty in our communities. Our health rankings by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, we're the 7th healthiest in the state of Washington. And did you know that Marion County is the 9th healthiest in the state of Oregon? So that's very good. Unfortunately, both of our communities have really high ACE scores for our total population. So Thurston County, where I'm from, about a third of our population has 4 or more ACEs. So it's very similar struggles, and I think I stole Chan's title from his book, Hope Rising, because I really just feel the energy in this room and how excited all of you are about hope and Chan's presentation this morning. And we're your sisters in that. We have been on this pathway to building hope in our community as well. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit more about how we came to be. So hope in our community of Thurston County, I mentioned our ACEs, 32% for our population. But one thing that was really interesting that we found out when that study came, Dr. Folletti's incredible work, and I know you all had the chance to hear from Dr. Folletti, I believe it was last year. We also got the chance to hear from Dr. Folletti, and were really inspired by that work and wanted to measure ACEs in our community and see what we could do about it. In our region, our 2 neighboring counties are the 1st and 2nd highest ACEs. So we have a cluster of really traumatized people and kids that we are really, really concerned about. And we just didn't know what to do. One of my personal experiences with that trauma and frustration is when I had my youngest son, the little boy in the picture earlier, Liam. I had him at our local community hospital, and while I was there in labor, I noticed that one of my clients from the Family Support Center was also there. She was a young mom, about 19 years old, had some struggles, had a little bit of developmental delays, and had exited foster care to homelessness. And she was having her baby too, and she had a little boy also, baby boy, in the room next to me. And while I was adoring my newborn and recovering from that exhaustion, I started to hear crying, and it got louder and louder and louder. And then I heard the most primal scream. And anybody here in this room that is a parent, you just hear this scream, and it was just sent chills through my body. And I held my baby tighter. I was just like, oh my gosh, what's going on here? And it was this young woman, and she was screaming this animalistic cry and saying, "Please don't take my baby. I know that I can be a good mom. Just give me a chance." And the baby was removed from her care. And it was such a hard experience for me to hear that, and had seen how hopeful she was when she was pregnant. And then to go back to work at my job at the Family Support Center, and I was really lucky that I got to bring my baby to work, and to see her come in with beyond despair, total hopelessness, complete apathy. And I thought, we have to do something. We have to do something in this community. So we gathered shortly after that our coalition for children, families, and youth, and decided that we were really going to focus on trauma and focus on reducing ACEs in our community. But we really just didn't know what to do. You can see this little cartoon here is, oh, well, just ignore that and hope it goes away. That wasn't going to work. So we really needed some hope in our community. We had these really high ACE rates, high rates of domestic violence, a growing homeless population. Children make up the largest population of our homeless in Olympia. We have about 2,000 homeless children on our streets in Olympia, throughout the whole Thurston County, not just Olympia. Also, our nonprofits and our community leaders and those on our Council for Children, Family, and Youth just were sharing really high rates of burnout, lots of vicarious trauma. We tried to have, trainers come in and help us, but we were reaching that point of despair. People in fields like all of us work in or touch tend to have higher ACEs ourselves in our life. It's not an uncommon thing for you to hear me say that I have 5 ACEs. A lot of people that I know have high ACEs. 70% of people who do the kind of work that all of us do have at least 1 ACE. 54% have 2 or more. 16% have 4 or more. Sometimes I think it could be more than that. These 2 little boys here, the oldest one is my son Dylan. He's almost 20, and that's Liam, who I was just telling you about. Dylan, due to our experiences, or my earlier experiences that I shared with you, also has 5 ACEs. Luckily, Liam, my goal is for him to have fewer than 1 for sure. So. The other thing that we really noticed in our work was ACEs in our workplaces. So not only in the nonprofit sector where I was working at the time, but in education, in health, and criminal justice. All of our partners were starting to track this more. We had started to implement ACEs surveys throughout our community. So we were doing that in the center that I worked in, and our several of our other community partners and government partners started measuring it as well. So this is just a little bit, this isn't going to be any surprise to any of you, and I know you know quite a bit about this already, but the more ACEs that someone has, the more likely they are to be absent from work, to have serious financial problems, serious job problems, and we were really seeing that play out in our community. It started to become a real economic problem for us. Our Economic Development Council, our Rotary clubs, our Chamber of Commerce really started to pay attention to this as well. So everybody started to say, we know we have high ACEs, what are we going to do about it? We really were focused on building protective factors in our community and finding ways to increase social connections and to raise the resilience and access to concrete needs in times of support. We do that real well in our community. That's all of our pathways that we have to really support these families. But it just wasn't quite enough. We were happy that we could do the ACEs survey, and that helped us to have a more trauma-informed lens to offer the services, but it was like, welcome to our center, here's some paperwork, and by the way, have you ever been sexually abused? Did your parents ever beat you? Do you feel like that no one loves you? So, pretty intensive questions to then just leave the person with. So, and we couldn't just say, hope for the best. Then along came Chan. So I, along with my friend, our Thurston County prosecutor, John Thunheim, and several delegates from our community, we had county commissioners and nonprofit leaders and our domestic violence sexual assault providers, went to a conference. I believe the first one was in Dallas. We went to International Family Justice Center conference and Child Advocacy Center. And we heard from Dr. Folletti there too, and then this person that we had not heard of before, Dr. Chan Hellman, came up. And he started talking about hope, and it was just the light that we needed and the light that we were looking for. So we decided to invite, we attacked Chan after his talk and found out everything that we could about hope, and we learned you can actually measure hope. And hope is learned, and we can do something to help all these families in our communities that have been struggling with adverse childhood experiences. So, Chan, do you want to come up here? So Chan's going to just repeat some of what you heard this morning, but we just think it's worth talking about a little bit more because it really emphasizes why hope was so important for us.
So, can you guys hear me? So one of the things that we want to highlight is the idea that as we've been studying hope at the university, well, that makes sense. Right? Suddenly I'm nervous again. But one of the important things that we learned about hope and need to be able to communicate are some of the things on this chart, and that is that hope is universal. And so one of the things that I would ask, for instance, is what is your sort of reaction when I say that hope for me is the same as it is for the homeless youth in downtown Tulsa? Does that create a little tension?
It can't be.
Huh?
It can't be the same.
It can't be the same? Right? Many of us are trained with the idea of sort of the cultural influences on that. And what I want to highlight is that I think in the long run I'm going to agree with you a little bit, but I'm going to start by saying that hope is universal. That hope for me is the same as it is for you. It's the same as it is for the homeless youth. Right? It's the same as it is for our clients because it's all grounded in the idea of goals, pathway, and agency. Goals, pathway, and agency. That's the nature of hope. Where it differs is the nature of the goals that I'm able to set. I have access to pathways that perhaps the homeless youth do not have. Right? And so the differences lay in terms of the quality aspects of that, but it's still grounded in the idea of goals, pathway, and agency. and the important aspect of the fact that pathways thinking and goal-setting activities can be learned and enhanced and nurtured and ultimately sustained. And so I think it's important to recognize that it's universal across race and gender and different demographic characteristics. I just had a student finish his dissertation looking at hope and well-being and comparing sexual gender minority groups, the sexual orientation. And what we know is that community has higher levels of depression, higher levels of suicidal ideation, but the nature of hope and its importance with well-being was exactly the same as other populations, other samples. So the nature of hope is universal, right? Interestingly enough, the similar thing as it relates to intelligence and developmental disabilities, it's still goals, pathway, and agency. There's actually no relationship found in the literature on developmental disabilities and hope, different aspects of the way that we measure that. But I guess that's just the thing that is so important, is that hope is such a universal concept across disciplines and across populations, right? As I mentioned this morning, the impact in education is phenomenal. I mean, that literature. By the way, for those of you who have an interest in the education and want to learn more about that, if you just Google Gallup and Hope, you'll find their reports. They actually produce a report every year. They study, like I mentioned earlier, roughly 1 million 5th through 12th grade students every year, and then they track many of those students. And what they find is very consistent year after year, is that hope tends to be the single best predictor of academic performance and academic achievement for school-age children K through 12. Most of the research is in 5th grade through 12th grade. I'll repeat it because I think there may be some new folks in here. Hope is also a better predictor of college performance than ACT, SAT, and high school GPA. What's beautiful about that is that we can measure hope in 6 items with children, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. So while there are such profound educational outcomes associated with hope, it's also important to recognize from the Gallup research that less than half of the children report being hopeful in our nation. And in fact, most or a larger percentage of our students report being disengaged from the educational process, right? It's such an important concept, but there's not a lot of it going on. With the work, you can see in terms of clear and direct relationships with absenteeism, turnover, and performance. I was sitting there thinking during some of the presentation with the A score, and Gallup actually looks at disengagement in the workplace and demonstrates that it's a $300 billion economic impact to the United States annually, and that hasn't changed in the last 15 years. That we have a high rate of disengagement in the workplace, and it's costing our country a tremendous economic burden. And what we know from the work is that there's a really strong negative association between disengagement and hope, that higher scores on hope are associated with more engagement in the workplace. And so it begins to offer us strategies of, if we want an engaged workforce, how do we nurture hope so that we can turn that ship around. With regards to, again, just the health outcomes, I'm used to looking at the TV. So we see with improved health-seeking behaviors, improved compliance to treatment, there is a phenomenal amount of work in cancer, the importance of hope in terms of responding to treatment. There's just a fantastic book that I highly recommend called The Anatomy of Hope, And The Anatomy of Hope was written by Jerome Groopman, an oncologist who highlights, almost in a case study format, the impact that hope has on clients. Have you read the book? It's just, and then ultimately his own struggle with his illness and hope. I will tell you that this is where most of the literature actually is. Most of the research on hope is actually in the healthcare industry. While there's a growing research, there's less in the social sciences. And so just a tremendous impact across disciplines.
I really like that, being in public health. So, who needs a little more hope here in the room? Has anyone ever felt like you're on this island? Yeah. Do you think that that message of hope is what they need? I look at that and I think, that's probably what's going to make them survive more than anything else. So hope is universal, and that's one of the things that has made it so easy for our community to embrace. There's something for everyone in this room, no matter what you do. So I would just like to know a little bit more about who's in the room today. So if you could stand up if you fit in any of these categories, and you can stay standing. So business. Any business people? Employers? It's probably a lot of you. Workforce development. Economic development. Criminal justice. Military. Chan actually does a lot of work with the military on hope. Health. Public health, healthcare. How about education? Nonprofits. Communities, that should be just about everybody here. Everybody should be standing at this point. Communities, you, your family. Just look around the room for a second. Everyone needs hope, and hope is contagious. So we have the power to really build hope here in Marion County. Thank you. Yeah, clap for that. So we realized that hope could be applied in so many areas, not only in Thurston County, but in the state of Washington. Like you, being the state capital, we're really close to state government. So a lot of us that were really inspired by Chan decided that we can really spread this message of hope and figure out how we can apply it in as many areas as possible. So we went on a big tour of all different places. Sometimes we got to have Chan with us. Sometimes we had a little cadre of hope trainers. The Washington State Asset Building Conference, our Family Justice Center, Alliance for Hope. We had 3 days of hope in Thurston. So it was basically like this, except for we got to have Chan for 3 intensive days in a row. And it was incredible. We had breakout sessions for all the different sectors, or several of the different sectors that we just covered. And it was very, very powerful, and everyone had a takeaway. The Washington State Employment Security Department contacted me and also was really interested in some of that research that Chan just shared about the cost of high ACEs in the workplace and how hope can really make a difference and really improve so many aspects of employment. Our Workforce Development Council did the same, and they actually started administering the HOPE survey to all of those that were coming to seek jobs. Our Thurston County Chamber of Commerce featured several different sessions on HOPE and the business community got really engaged. So much so that our Thurston County Chamber Foundation donated lots of resources, as well as became the lead fiscal agent for our Thurston Thrives initiative. Thurston Thrives is our collective impact locally in Olympia that's based around the social determinants of health. And so the areas in which we focus our work are children, youth, and families. That's probably our biggest, most active group. Homelessness and housing, economic development, clinical care and health care, criminal justice, and climate and clean energy, which also really resonated with Hope. And they actually started working on incorporating Hope into some of their community design strategies, which maybe Chan can tell us a little more about how they did that in Tulsa as well. So our treatment courts and the Gambling Commission also had a conference, and they were really excited to take this and start applying it in their work. The prosecuting attorneys, substance use, youth prevention work, and then, of course, our Department of Children and Families at the state, and the local, the Low Income Housing Alliance as well. So lots of people are really interested in this work and have actually taken this and put it into action. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we have put Hope into action. So the Nurse Family, how many of you are familiar with Nurse Family Partnership Program? So it is an evidence-based home visitation program. It's maternal child health. It partners nurses with usually young, at-risk pregnant moms that are having their first baby. The outcomes of this program are just incredible. Long-term health and social benefits to that mom and baby. It's an amazing program. It's also a program in which there's a lot of trauma. We're talking about a lot of pregnant teens that have had a lot of ACEs themselves, and now they're finding themselves with a new baby to take care of. They don't know how to take care of a baby at all. They haven't had an example of that. And our public health nurses go work with them, visit them, and mentor them for two whole years. It's very hard work. A lot of burnout there, but the nurses that do it are very, very passionate about what they do. When I came to public health, I thought, I think Hope could really make a difference in their work. And so our nurses got the chance to hear from Chan at a training as well, and it really resonated with them, and they began to administer the Hope survey with their clients. And I'm going to tell you a little story about one of the most amazing young women I have ever had the chance to meet. She's 17 years old and found herself pregnant with a boyfriend that not a healthy relationship, dating violence, and just very, very difficult circumstances. Her parents weren't happy about her being pregnant, and they kicked her out. So she had to go live with the boyfriend's family. So it kind of kept her in that unhealthy environment. But nevertheless, she was committed to staying in school and committed to being a good mom and making a great life for her baby. And she was very excited and very hopeful. The second she could sign up, right after she found out she was pregnant, she called us up and said, I want an appointment with the nurse, because one of her friends had been in the program. So she got paired with her nurse, and they had a great relationship, and she learned all about prenatal care and parenting and community resources and all kinds of things, and learned about how to keep herself healthy during her pregnancy for her baby, so her baby could have the best start in life. When her son was born, it was a big surprise to everyone that he was born with his heart outside of his body, and he was born without an anus and several other serious disabilities. As you can imagine, this poor young girl was feeling totally hopeless. Like, what am I going to do with this baby? And how is my baby going to have a future? And right around that time is when we implemented hope into the work. So her nurse brought her the hope worksheet, which we're going to get the chance to practice with in a little bit, and assessed her hope. Her hope was so low. It was one of the lowest hope scores that we had seen at that time, right after her baby was born. It's usually a time when people's hopes maybe a little bit higher, but no, hers was low as can be. But she started, the only thing she really could find was hope. And she started looking at her pathways, her agency, setting her goals. And this girl, oh my gosh, brave, strong, very, very powerful agency. And while her hope was low, the one area was agency, because she wanted the best for her baby. And all of our parents that have babies, they want the best for them. So they began working on developing hope and looking at the kind of barriers that she had been through. And at first, she couldn't see any way past those barriers. She couldn't find the pathways. But then she realized, as time went on, and by time, I mean just 2 months, actually. 2 months went by. And she realized how much she had overcome. And she could find so many pathways and so much hope for her baby. And I got to go on a visit to see her around Christmas time. And her baby's so happy and cute and smiling. She is the most hopeful person I've ever met. She kept talking and talking to me using the language of hope. It was just incredible to get to see it actually works. And while it's really simple, it's amazing to see how powerful it can be in the lives of our kids and families that we're working with. In our community, our case managers in our social services programs at the nonprofit that I worked at, the Family Support Center of South Sound, also began to implement hope. We were actually the second nonprofit in the country that took Chan's adult hope scale and decided to put it to work. We incorporated it into our intake process. So we would administer the ACEs survey, and as well as some of our other too much paperwork, and then administer the hope scale. So we could start to see that the clients that we were working with had very high ACEs, pretty low hope, until we really started focusing on building those pathways and talking about agency and talking about hope and using the worksheet. And it's been amazing. We've seen hope increase in just that one visit. That's one of the beautiful things that I love about using hope and applying it in our work is you get instant results. And we're actually measuring your hope right now. You didn't know that you're in our little experiment here. So we'll get to tell you the results later of that. So I mentioned our WorkSource. Our WorkSource office implemented the Hope Scale and the Hope Worksheet in helping clients set goals for employment, their personal goals for employment, and looking at how hopeful people were about finding a job. Our coordinated entry for homeless populations began to also utilize the Adult Hope Scale and also the Children's Hope Scale in our homeless shelter for children and families. And that has been really amazing. In our Domestic Violence Family Justice Center with human trafficking and sexual assault survivors, along with the danger assessment that everyone completes at the beginning of their visit, we also have a look at their hope. And we really want to help them find those pathways to safety and hope so they can get through their experience. We've had a community schools initiative, and it initially was very focused on mitigating ACEs in the classroom. And the teachers recognized how much it was really impacting the classroom environment and the learning, especially when it comes to early learning and having kids ready for kindergarten. Our rates for kindergarten readiness were extremely low. Our schools have begun to implement HOPE into their curriculums, and our pediatricians' offices that were very excited about looking at ACEs and evaluating trauma so that they could address the potential health impacts of those with ACEs amongst the kids that they were working with and the parents that they were working with, have found HOPE to be a really great tool to implement. We're all a work in progress. We're trying out this. We're experimenting with it. This isn't a grand research study that we're doing, but that's one of the beautiful things also about HOPE is that all of us can apply it, and it's very flexible and very adaptable. It doesn't cost anything. But it makes an incredible difference. As I started to implement this in the Family Support Center, I realized that in order for us to be able to try to inspire hope in others, we had to do it for ourselves first. All that trauma I was telling you about and high burnout, I thought, I wonder what our hope scores are. So we administered the hope scale to our employees, and we were really shocked about some of the low hope scores. Our employees came to work every day with a smile on their face, but inside they were really, really struggling. So we realized we're going to have to build hope within before we can go out to the rest of the community and help the families and kids that we were working with. So we started using that as a professional development tool. Every single one of our staff meetings became centered around hope. It was always a topic. We utilized the hope worksheet and incorporated that into our employee evaluations and goal settings. And we saw our employee satisfaction just skyrocket. The morale was so much better when we started all using the language of hope. This message of hope and all those conferences and groups in which our hope champions talked to, we realized that the language of hope was spreading around our community. And even in sectors that you wouldn't expect, we started hearing agency, but they weren't talking about organization agencies. We started hearing pathways. People could talk to each other about hope using that common language, and that made such an incredible difference. Everyone in our community started aligning around this. So we're going through our county strategic plan right now, and we had newly elected county commissioners this last election, and they were really excited about hope and actually incorporated hope into our new mission vision for our whole entire county. And that includes our employees and every single person that we touch. When I took my position at the health department, hope became one of our values. And it's guiding everything that we do. Our Thirst and Thrives group that I was sharing with you, really, we're trying to achieve collective impact on lots of different areas. The whole point of collective impact is that you're coming together and you're moving the needle on something that's really important and needed in the community. And when you're dealing with so many complex social issues like homelessness and like domestic violence and poverty, adverse childhood experiences and these low graduation rates. There's so many different things that are so important, and you really want to do all of them together. We realized that hope was the common denominator for all of those. With all of the research that Chan shared with you about education impact, economic impact, community impact, leadership impact, hope is this one. If we can raise the hope of even one person or everyone, then we're going to achieve all of those goals together. So we have embarked on a initiative to measure the hope of Thurston County. We're going to kind of follow Tulsa's lead on that. We have a hope committee that has many of our community leaders on it that meets every week. And our goal is to have hope trainers in every sector in our community and to broadly implement the tools that we're going to go over with you today. So we've got funders behind us. People are really excited. Chan's coming out to visit us next month. Don't try to steal him and convince him to come back here, because we want to keep him with us in Olympia as long as possible. We have this new logo called Hope Thurston, and so you can see that there. The committee just passed that, so we're really excited about the potential, and I think that this is something that your community might be interested in joining us on. So another way in which we've seen hope in action is through Camp Hope. So you heard a little bit about the success of Camp Hope nationally. There are, I think, about 30 or so Camp Hopes operating throughout the country. In Oregon, you have a couple. I got the chance to visit one out by Mount Hood, and it was amazing, just incredible. If you ever have a chance to volunteer or go to your nearby Camp Hope, I highly encourage it. It will transform you to see these kids developing hope in just 1 week. So we learned about Camp Hope and thought, we want to bring this to Washington. So the first ever Camp Hope Washington was just held this August, and I'm going to show you a little video about what that was like for the kids that got to attend.
Okay. So on your desk, you have several packets. What I want to kind of do, we'll start moving into the actual interactive part of it here pretty quickly. But what I wanted to highlight is that we've included the measures, both the Children's Hope Scale and the Adult Hope Scale. So let's see, in the packet that starts off with the Hope Introduction discussion, some of the things that are on your table are just resources for you to take away. So, for instance, the Hope Introduction discussion is really, once you start talking about goals, pathway, and agency, these are just sort of suggested discussion questions to facilitate a conversation. So, for instance, if we know that hope is about goals, pathway, and agency, and pathways are the mental strategies to attain the goal, and agency is the willpower of that. We've all heard the statement, for instance, where there's a will, there's a way, right? And so in the context of what we've learned about hope so far, what is your reaction to that statement? Is it accurate? Where there's a will, there's a way? I'm seeing kind of some of both. So yeah, so what happens is when there's a will, that agency, we are looking for a way. We are really motivated to begin to try to find strategies to attain our goal. The difficulty happens when we don't find the pathway. And so obviously when the pathway doesn't appear, the willpower then will plummet. Now what happens for lower hope individuals is you elevate their willpower ever so slightly about a goal that they want to achieve. But if no pathway appears, it's one more failure. It's one more example. And so we have to think about some of those statements in the context of all of the components of hope. And so again, this part of the handout is just meant to be to enhance or suggest some conversations about that. So for instance, how many of you have had a goal put for you, say in the workplace or in some other area, that you didn't really care that much about? Right? All of us, right? Right? So in that context, how does hope work? Right? What happens to willpower if you don't desire the goal? It doesn't really matter, right? I'm not going to try that hard. I'm actually just drag my feet. I'm probably doing something because I feel like I have to do something, right? And so we don't really look very closely at the pathways. We'll do the minimum kind of effort, right? Alternatively, when you have a goal that you highly desire, right, you will search for pathways, right? In this context, and I'll get to the measures in just a second. When I start talking about hope, sometimes my eyes will roll into the back of my head, and time has no meaning for me. Just trying to remember where I was going with that. So when we think about our goals and the goals that we set and the pathways, how often are your pathways involving other people? How important are others around you to not only enhance your willpower, but to help you along the way? Earlier I said in my presentation that each and every one of you are pathways of hope for those around you. Each and every one of us have to recognize that hope is a social gift that we can bestow upon each other. We can build hope, we can nurture hope, and we can certainly destroy hope, right? And so I think if that's in fact true, we need to become much more intentional about the way we interact with each other, right? So oftentimes also what I recognize is that sometimes my goals are not your goals, right? What I want to achieve is not necessarily what you want to achieve. And so I think, again, in the context of hope, how do we begin to have a conversation or begin to think about, is your goal my pathway? Does that make sense? So if I help you achieve your goal, it will springboard me to the effort of achieving a goal. And so we have to reframe when we think that there might be some potential goal conflict or goal incongruence. Can we reframe it so that my goal is your pathway or vice versa, right? Because if we remember, pathways are embedded as a bunch of sub-goals, benchmarked pathways, right? And there are many pathways to a goal. So if I want to talk about both measures, adult and children's. If you look on the second page, so I know, like even the people in the front row, when I stand it up, you can't even see what I'm looking at, right? But it's the one that looks like that. That's the adult hope scale. Doesn't that look really professional? I learned Microsoft Word and borders and tables and shading so that I could actually create that. And I just think that looks super cool, and I get so many complaints about the way that looks, right? Because your eyes have to go, and you have to try to remember that. And so you're still getting my version of that because I worked really hard at designing it. And I'll tell you the reason why. I designed it so that it looks like it was professionally developed, so that people who are participating in my surveys think that I spent significant resources to have this created, so that they feel some obligation to fill out the survey. if we have time to have a conversation about collective hope and measuring community hope, what I will tell you is everything that you need to focus on is how do you get people to participate in the measures. If we can't measure it, we can't study it. When you do community-wide assessments or when you do a hope assessment in your organization or with your clients, it automatically becomes the baseline by which to compare. And the only way that it can have implications is if you have enough people participate that you have meaningful data. And that was the lesson we learned for How Hopeful is Tulsa. Tulsa has a population of about 450,000 individuals, give or take with the MSA around that. And we were thrilled to death to have 1,000 people respond to our survey, right? But the question is 1,000 people representative of Tulsa? Tulsa's I'm being recorded, so I'll be really nice. Tulsa's a very segregated city. And so anyway, getting people to fill out the survey is the tough part. But if you will take a few seconds to look at the adult hope scale and look at the items, and you filled it out at the beginning, Tamara asked you to fill this out, and we'll talk about your scores in just a little while. But what do you think of those items? Right? What do you think of those items? I can find many ways to get out of a jam. So who still talks like that? Right? So the reason I highlight that is because when I first see this measure of hope 10 years ago, I was very skeptical. I really, I'm not really sure that's a great question or statement to ask people to respond to as it relates to hope. And so, like most of you or all of you, I'm a skeptic. And so I think, okay, well, I'm going to get to study hope, and the agency's letting me use a really bad measure, right, to do that. And so I will tell you that what I have done over the years is I've looked at the psychometric properties of this scale. And so what we've done recently is we took every single published study that has used this scale, and so a couple thousand studies. And when we received them, I looked at all of the validity and reliability measures in those publications, and then I statistically analyzed all of those at the collective level. And here's my takeaway. This is a really good measure. It works really well. There are domain-specific hope scales, like, for instance, education. So there's a hope score for education. There's a hope score for family. There's a hope score for health. All of the different domains. And I will tell you, every single time, this measure outperforms goal-specific measures, right? Which is kind of intriguing. But I would also argue this philosophically, right, is that I think that the work that you're doing transcends that immediate goal. I think that if you're, for instance, looking at stable housing and the goal is to get stable housing, you're actually building a holistic person or opportunity for that individual to think beyond that one moment in time. And that's why I really like the adult hope scale. You're developing a disposition, a belief that the future, any future, can be better in that. And that's what we find very consistently. So I'm a real big advocate of this measure, even though I still remain skeptical that anybody uses the word jam.
We use it all the time now.
And, and expects to be taken seriously, kind of thing. The measure is intended to be a total scale score, a total score of hope. However, as you filled it out at your tables earlier and what's on this, there's also the dimensions of pathway and agency. So you actually get a sense of which one is higher. Is agency higher than pathways? Are they both high? Are they both low? So that if you're working with an individual, it's just an indication and a point in time about where that individual is. If they're lower on agency, then you know that you need to do motivational type work, right? If their pathways are not present, then you need to do more of the scripting or the idea of helping to do planning sessions. So the score is really intended to augment the conversations you're already having and to help kind of guide where you want to place your efforts to nurture hope. As you guys filled it out earlier, you'll notice that it takes about 5 minutes to fill out. It doesn't take very long, and yet the impact across all the different disciplines using this measure is so profound. So profound, right? Which is what I love about it. You want to talk about the Children's Hope Skill? Children's Hope. Oh, okay. So on the very next page, going back to the Camp Hope, this is the Children's Hope Scale, and it's a 6-item measure. Now, the 6-item measure has been validated for children ages 7 to 17, okay? Ages 7 to 17. In Camp Hope, we will use it with 6-year-olds, right? And so in that, phone's going crazy. In that context, oftentimes a counselor is kind of sitting with the child and asking them the questions, kind of helping them fill it out. And what I would tell you is that the work that you do is not an experimental lab for somebody like me. And what's interesting and what's more important is the applied work that you do and getting a sense of a child's hope and their response. Now, when I first started administering this, I have a granddaughter who's 8 years old. Actually, she just turned 9 on Saturday. And when I first started using this, she was 7. And this scale is validated for 7-year-olds. And again, I mentioned I'm a skeptic. And so I look at these items and I think, I'm not sure my granddaughter knows the difference between a little of the time and some of the time, right? And understands the nuances of these response formats. And because, number one, I'm not sure I understand the differences of those kinds of things. I mean, seriously, you know, in that framework. So I did very similar to what we did with the Hope Scale. We collected all the published studies, several hundred studies, because I was interested in an age bias relative to my granddaughter. And same results. What I will tell you is it's a really good measure. It works really well for 7-year-olds and up. I will tell you that we've also looked at language translations of it. And some of and basically the big takeaway is that even the language translations work really well with the instrument. So, so for those of you who did look at it and kind of shook your head and said, yeah, right, I'm right there with you. I'm the same person. I'm skeptical. I'm also an empiricist, which means everything for me is a research question, and the data should tell us what the answer is. And I can tell you the data is good. My goal, I'm actually really, really glad that you said that. My goal is collective impact. I can conduct all of the research, all of the publications I have, all of the studies I've done are great and wonderful and exciting, and it feels good to do that, but there's a bigger picture. And the bigger picture is this idea of social advocacy, right? If we can begin to collectively talk about hope and not do it with embarrassment or a timid nature, that's my goal. I want you to move past being embarrassed by using the word hope. The science is solid. Move past it, right? The metrics are good. That's my goal.